Some things are inevitable. Death, taxes, and modern video games not being as good as they used to be. The Pokemon franchise is probably the biggest modern culprit of this phenomenon. I genuinely do not remember the last time a Pokemon game was widely acclaimed since maybe Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, and even that's pushing it. It just seems to be the standard of Pokemon games these days. Legends ZA, the last big Pokemon game to come out, only further sent this point home. Pokemon used to be the gold standard for Nintendo, helped inspire the RPG genre as a whole, and every game was an instant classic. But the modern iterations? Not so much. Why is this the case? Did these games get worse? Are they made with less effort? I feel like I'm fairly in the middle of the aisle. I am far from the biggest fan of the modern titles, but I didn't hate them either. In Legends ZA, I finished the post-game, research challenges, and Pokedex with no fuss. I actually had a lot of fun, but even I noticed a difference from the handheld generations. Why? For this video, I'm going to break this down into 3 parts, which are inspired by the 3 most common criticisms I see of modern Pokemon: the graphics, the optimization, and the difficulty. My name is Rumbus, and through these points, I'd argue that Pokemon didn't change at all. We did. I think this is probably the biggest and most glaring criticism of modern Pokemon, so I'm going to start with it here. The graphics. The graphics in recent Pokemon games suck. I remember when Sword and Shield were announced and people were upset at the trees in the very first gameplay trailer. And to be honest, I don't blame them. They looked pretty dreadful. But what I will say is that if you're going to critique modern Pokemon's graphics, you also have to critique classic Pokemon's graphics, which, as we will come to find out, were not that much better. Yes, I love the pixel art style. Emerald is one of my favorite games of all time, and the graphics definitely hold up due to that art style. But let's not pretend for 1 second that Pokemon's graphics have ever been good, or even current in the industry. Let's look at 2 examples. Here is a screenshot from one of the leading titles on the Game Boy Color, Tomb Raider. And here is a screenshot from Pokemon Gold and Silver. See the difference? That's okay if you don't. This one is a little bit mild. We can look at a slightly clearer example. Here is a screenshot from one of my personal favorite games, Luigi's Mansion on the GameCube, which came out in 2001. I want to draw your attention to the dynamic shadows and 3D models. And here is a screenshot from Pokemon Colosseum on the same system that was released after this game. We go from smooth 3D models to grainy polygons. Yet, people loved Colosseum and still do to this day. Long story short, Pokemon graphics have always been bad, which is why it has been so weird to me when people suddenly decided to start caring about them. This is not to say that graphics aren't important, they absolutely are, but we need to be consistent in our criticisms. If we hate on, say, Legends ZA for PNG Windows in 2025, we also have to hate on the first 3 generations of Pokemon for having little to no animation and instead opting for shaking sprites. Food for thought. The level of optimization in modern Pokemon probably goes without saying, but I still wanted to touch on it and compare it to the previous games. Modern Pokemon games are very poorly optimized, like laughably so. I cannot think of a game I've encountered more bugs in than in Scarlet and Violet. Well, maybe a Bethesda title, but I digress. Crashes, low FPS, the list goes on. But frankly, when have Pokemon games not been broken? Let's remember Missing No in Gen 1, Bad Eggs in Gen 3. Hell, I remember being 10 using QR codes to scan in glitched mystery gifts on my 3DS. How does that even happen? How can a 10-year-old break your game? The answer is that it happens in poorly optimized games, which Game Freak has been excelling at since 1996. Are you starting to see my point now? Okay, This is my last piece of evidence before we get into the conclusion. The hand holding. This is probably the easiest for me to compare to the classics just because of how many times I've replayed Pokemon, especially the first couple hours. When I was 10, I found XY impossible. I could not tell you how many times I lost to that Elite Four. Yet the reviews of the game talked about how incredibly easy and handholdy these games were. And guess what? They're right. When I picked XY back up again as an adult, incredibly easy. Name any Pokemon game I played throughout my childhood and I can recount almost the exact same experience. I remember being utterly and totally unable to catch Rayquaza in Emerald. That flying snake wrecked my team more times than I can count. But every time I return to Gen 3 as an adult, it is almost laughably easy. Even the most famous, difficult battles in the early Pokemon games are easily beaten if you're A, properly leveled, or B, have a counter Pokemon, which in most cases are readily available. Having trouble with Whitney's Miltank? Good thing Heracross is available at this point in the game. Why do you think people have nuzlocked the classic Pokemon games to death if they weren't looking for a real challenge? I think at the end of the day, even though Pokemon can be and is in many cases for everybody, it is still directed at a younger audience. I think Pokemon being easy and holding your hand through a long-winded tutorial is just part of the genre at this point. Did I like backtracking to Pallet Town to deliver Oak's package? Of course not, but I'm not counting that as a black mark against those games. The reality is that we just don't remember it as much because of our age or because we were learning that type of game for the first time and actually appreciated the tutorial. Overall, an instruction manual shouldn't be indicative of the quality of the product. The point I am trying to make here is that the seemingly modern issues of Pokemon have always been around. They just haven't been focused on due to the innovation and mystery of the franchise in the past. Does that mean that classic Pokemon is suddenly bad? No, of course not. Emerald is my #2 favorite game of all time. Shamelessly plugging my backlogged. But does it mean the modern games are good? Also no. What? How can both of these be true when both the modern and classic iterations of Pokemon have such similar Achilles heels? Well, it's because the gaming industry, and thus gaming culture, is constantly changing. Pokemon is largely the exact same franchise it was 30 years ago, making almost the same games every release cycle. Why? Because it works. Even if a game does bad, they still sell cards, toys, the list goes on. Hell, if this was political science class, I would argue Pikachu is a figurehead of late-stage capitalism. Pokemon has moved away from the games being their main source of revenue, but they continue to make them due to it being a spearhead for their other revenue streams. I think Reddit user 1270011 said it best. Without a new game, there isn't a new region for the anime to adapt. There isn't new Pokemon to make cards and plushies. Modern Pokemon has had little to no innovation to make it a competitor in such a saturated video game market because, well, it doesn't need to. I firmly believe that if you released any of the modern Pokemon games 10 to 15 years prior, they would be instant classics. At the end of the day, Pokemon was and still is a product of a time long past. That's what led to its success, and that is what's hurting the games now. I want to end by comparing Pokemon to two other beloved franchises that have gone through immense change in the modern day: Assassin's Creed and The Legend of Zelda. Assassin's Creed tried to innovate too much. They shifted from a stealth and story-based game into an open-world RPG, which robbed many of the new titles of the very thing people loved about them. Zelda, however, did the opposite. It used what I'm going to call controlled innovation. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom completely changed the series while keeping the authentic Zelda nucleus. Zelda didn't try to change too much like the Assassin's Creed series had, but they also didn't remain stagnant like Pokemon has been. That is why gimmicks like Mega Evolution and Terastallization have been Pokemon's most successful gimmicks, because they innovate. In summary, the issues with Pokemon aren't so much due to quality, but rather due to the time period they're coming out in. So, no, Pokemon games didn't get any worse. The industry just got better at making video games, and we got better at playing them. Hey guys, I want to say thank you for watching. This was definitely a bit of a controversial one, so if you disagree or have any thoughts, please leave them in the comments. I spent a lot of time on this video, so I really want to know what you guys think. See ya!